lying in a quiet room. The night has come fully in, the way it does in the small hours, not arriving exactly, but simply present, the way it always was once the day stopped insisting on itself. There is nothing left to decide, nothing left to finish. Whatever the day held, it is held somewhere else now, in the part of time that is already the past, and the past is not asking anything of you. Tonight we are going to a painting that is, by any ordinary measure, very small. Smaller than you think? Smaller than it has any right to be, given the size of its presence in the world. It is 44.5 centimeters tall and 39 centimeters wide, barely larger than a sheet of A3 paper, the kind of thing you might leave on a desk without a second thought. And yet, people travel across continents to stand in front of it. They wait in lines that stretch around buildings. They stand before it for longer than they plan to, and then they leave and find they are still thinking about it days later, turning it over in the mind the way you turn over a question that will not resolve. The painting is not about violence tonight. It is not about courage or war or the catastrophic cost of doing a necessary thing. It is about something quieter and stranger than any of that. It is about a face. A single face turning towards you in the dark, mouth very slightly open, eyes catching the light, and the unbearable, irresolvable question of what that face is thinking. The painting has been looking at people for more than 350 years. It looked at the citizens of Delft when it was new. It looked at whoever bought it at auction in 1696 for a sum that may have been 46 guilders or may have been 17. The records are unclear. And it looked at nobody in particular for the long years between then and 1881, when it appeared at a sale in The Hague, uncatalogued, unattributed, described as being in poor condition, and sold for 2 guilders and 30 cents. $2.30. Roughly the cost of a modest lunch. For a painting that is now one of the most recognized images in the world. Tonight it is going to look at you. And we are going to look back slowly for as long as it takes. The painting is called Girl with a Pearl Earring. It was made by Johannes Vermeer, probably around 1665, in a rented room in the Dutch city of Delft, in the years when Vermeer was at the height of his powers and had perhaps a decade left to live, though he did not know that. It lives now in the Mauritshuis, the Royal Picture Gallery in The Hague, a small and exquisite museum housed in a 17th century palace, one of those buildings that seems to understand exactly what it is for. We will stay with this painting for a long time tonight. Long enough to look at it from every angle, the painting itself, the story of the man who made it, the city he made it in, the extraordinary circumstances of its survival, the woman who wrote a novel about it, and the film that followed, and the team of scientists who spent months in 2018 looking at it through instruments that Vermeer could not have imagined, finding things that had been invisible for 3.5 centuries. But first, and for a long time first, the painting itself. Let us begin where Vermeer begins, with the dark. The background of girl with a pearl earring is, to the modern eye, a flat and featureless black, a void, an absence, the kind of darkness that seems to have no depth or texture, that exists simply to throw the figure in front of it into relief. Many thousands of words have been written about this background. Scholars and critics and poets have described it as the source of the painting's mystery, the thing that gives the girl her quality of timelessness, of appearing from nowhere and belonging to no particular moment or place. The featureless dark, the argument goes, strips away everything contingent, no room, no window, no furniture, no other people, and leaves only the essential, a face, a light, an encounter. And there is truth in that. There is real truth in it, and we will come back to what that dark does to the painting and to the person looking at it. But here is the thing that was discovered in 2018, when a team of conservators and scientists at the Mauritshuis examined the painting with instruments of extraordinary sensitivity. The background is not what Vermeer painted. What Vermeer painted was green. Not a flat, inert green, but a deep, rich, translucent green, built in 2 stages with the kind of patience and technical sophistication that characterizes everything Vermeer did. First, a layer of charcoal black applied in overlapping brushstrokes, varying in thickness, creating a textured foundation. Then, over the top of that, a semi-translucent glaze, 20 to 25 micrometers thick, made from 2 organic colorants, indigo for the blue, and weld, a yellow dye stuff almost certainly grown in the Netherlands for the warmth. The combination, when the glaze was fresh, produced something the scientists described as enamel-like, a deep, glossy, living green that played the black underlayer through it, like a shadow giving depth to still water. And then, over the centuries, it disappeared. Both indigo and weld undergo photooxidation when exposed to light. They bleach slowly and irreversibly, the color draining out of them the way color drains from a fabric left too long in a sunny window. The green glaze became blanched, then opaque, then mottled. A restoration in 1881, the same year the painting was bought for 2 guilders, used an aqueous lining and fish glue consolidation that caused the remaining glaze to swell and micro-crack, scattering what little light remained in it. And so, the rich green became the flat black we see today, and the flat black became the philosophical void that 3 centuries of writers have made it mean something. There is a small patch to the left of the girl's face where the green is slightly better preserved. A ghostly impression of what was. The scientists who found it described it as offering just enough of a sense of the original to make the loss of the rest feel more acute. And then they found something else. In the X-ray fluorescence maps, images that reveal the distribution of chemical elements across the surface of the painting, diagonal lines appeared in the upper and lower right corners of the canvas. Lines that followed the pattern of folds in draped fabric. A curtain. Vermeer had painted a curtain in the background, a green curtain fading now to invisibility, hanging at the right edge of the scene. The girl was not floating in an abstract void. She was standing in a room. A real room with a real curtain in a real house in Delft in the autumn of 1665 or thereabouts, in the particular quality of northern Dutch light that Vermeer spent his entire career studying and rendering, and that has never been exactly reproduced by anyone since. The curtain has completely faded from view. Almost nothing remains of it in any wavelength of light the naked eye can see. But it was there, and its presence means that everything that has been written about the painting's timelessness, about the dark void giving the girl a quality of existing outside of history, rests on an accident of chemistry. The timelessness was not intended. Vermeer placed her somewhere specific. Time took the somewhere away and left the timelessness behind. Whether the painting is more or less mysterious for knowing, this is a question worth sitting with. Now the girl herself. She appears from the upper center of the canvas, her body at a slight angle to us, her shoulders and torso turning away to the right, but her face has come back toward us. She has turned back, or she is in the process of turning back, caught in the middle of the movement, which is why her shoulders and her face do not quite align. She is turning, and we are seeing her in the turn, in the instant between one direction and another. This is one of the most psychologically sophisticated compositional decisions in the history of portraiture, if portrait is even the right word, which it probably is not, and which we will come back to. The pose suggests that something happened. She was looking elsewhere or moving away, and then something, a sound, a voice, a presence, drew her back. And this is the moment of that drawing back, the moment of recognition, the fraction of a second before she has had time to compose herself for being looked at. She has not had time to arrange her expression. She has not had time to put on the face she would wear for a formal portrait, the face of dignity and stillness and controlled self-presentation. She is simply responding to us, to the painter, to whatever it was that made her turn, and her response is completely unguarded. Her mouth is slightly open. Not much. Just enough to suggest that she is about to speak, or that she has just drawn breath to speak, or that speech is possible, that if you waited another second, you might hear her. The then director of the Mauritshuis has noted that the open mouth is unusual in Dutch Golden Age painting, where figures tend to be closed-mouthed, composed, self-contained. An open mouth is a mouth in the middle of something. It is a mouth that belongs to a person in motion, a person engaged with the world, a person who might say something back. Vermeer's girl might say something back. This is not a painting you can look at in peace. It looks at you in return, and it seems on the verge of speaking, and the fact that it never does, that the speech is always 1 second away, always just about to happen, is one of the primary sources of its power. Her eyes, they are large and dark, and they are directed precisely at the viewer, not past us, not slightly to the side, but at us, holding us, aware of us with an attentiveness that is difficult to escape. The whites are bright and clear. Vermeer has placed a small, brilliant highlight in the left eye, just a few strokes of white paint carefully positioned that gives it its quality of being lit from within, of being not merely illuminated but alive. The right eye, in deeper shadow, is rendered with slightly less precision, slightly less insistence, which is physiologically and perceptually accurate because we do not actually see both eyes equally when we look at a face. We look at one eye and the other is peripheral. Vermeer has painted that experience, not the face as it is, but the face as it is seen. The 2018 technical study discovered with some delight that she does have eyelashes. They had been invisible to the naked eye, too fine and dark against the shadowed portions of the face to register. But under microscopic examination they were there, thin strokes of dark paint along the upper lids, more delicate than a human hair. Previous scholarship had noted the absence of visible brows and lashes and had speculated that Vermeer was abstracting the face, moving away from specific physiognomy toward an idealized type. The lashes are evidence that he was not. He was painting a real face as precisely as he could, and the precision has simply exceeded what the naked eye can recover across 3.5 centuries. Her skin. The light source is to the upper left. We never see it. It exists outside the frame, but its direction and quality are legible in the way the light falls across her face. The left side of her face, the side toward the light, is warm and bright, the flesh rendered in creamy, slightly impastoed paint that Vermeer built up in layers, a yellowish underlayer first, then the flesh tones, blended to a seamless surface. The technical study found that in the most strongly lit areas, the paint itself is physically thicker, the impasto creating a slight topographic relief, a literal raising of the surface so that it catches more light. Vermeer painted light into the physical structure of the paint, not just onto its surface. The right side of her face falls into shadow along a curve that follows the cheekbone, and the transition between the lit side and the shadowed side is one of the most technically remarkable passages in the painting. It is imperceptible. Not gradual, imperceptible. There is no point at which you can say, here the light ends and the shadow begins. The two simply inhabit the same surface, the same face, with a continuity that is closer to what we actually experience when we look at a face in raking light than to anything that can be produced by mechanical blending. It is one of the passages most often cited by those who believe Vermeer used a camera obscura, because this kind of soft focus at the boundary of light and shadow is a characteristic of an image projected through a convex lens rather than the experience of direct vision. But it is also simply what a painter of extraordinary patience and sensitivity can achieve by looking very, very carefully at what is in front of him. The left side of the nose has no distinct line. The shadow dissolves into the cheek without a hard edge, without the incised contour that most painters of the period would have used to define the form. The nose exists not as a drawn shape, but as a modulation of tone. Lighter here, slightly cooler there, the form implied by the relationship between adjacent areas of paint rather than stated by any single mark. This too has been cited in the camera obscura debate. This too is simply extraordinary looking made into extraordinary paint. The microscopic examination found something else in the flesh paint of the face, embedded fragments of brush hairs. Tiny filaments of bristle, trapped in the paint as it dried, pressed there by Vermeer's hand moving across the canvas more than 350 years ago. The actual touch of the actual man. His brush, his hand, his arm, his eye measuring the distance between the model and the canvas and the canvas and the mark. The physical evidence of his presence, preserved in the paint the way a footprint is preserved in dried mud, not symbolic, not metaphorical, but literally there, recoverable under magnification 3 centuries later. The turban. It is the first thing many people notice, before the earring, before the eyes, before the expression, this extraordinary blue and yellow wrapped cloth that covers her hair entirely and rises above her head in a shape that has no parallel in the everyday dress of 17th century Dutch women. No woman in Delft would have gone to market in this. No woman in Delft would have worn this to church, or to visit her neighbors, or to sit for a formal portrait. It is a theatrical garment, an exotic invention, a costume, and its presence on her head is one of the clearest signals that this is not a portrait of a specific Dutch woman going about her specific Dutch life. The turban is painted with a boldness and economy that contrast markedly with Vermeer's treatment of the face. Where the face is built up in careful, blended, multi-layered paint, the turban is rendered in essentially 2 flat shapes, a sweeping form of deep ultramarine blue and a trailing edge of ochre yellow, both applied with confident, energetic brushstrokes that leave their marks visible. The blue is natural ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone extracted from mines in what is now Afghanistan, transported across thousands of miles of trade routes to arrive in the paint shops of Amsterdam and eventually into Vermeer's studio in Delft. It is one of the most expensive pigments available to any painter in the 17th century, and Vermeer uses it with a generosity that speaks to either his patron's resources or his own conviction that this particular blue demanded the real thing. The yellow trailing end of the turban, warmer, looser, painted with something approaching abandon, hangs down behind her right shoulder and catches a little of the light. Blue and yellow together against the dark, the colors of the Dutch Republic, which is probably not coincidental in a painter who was painting in the Dutch Republic, and may or may not have meant anything to Vermeer consciously, and means something or nothing to us now, and is one of those details that the painting holds in reserve, refusing to explain itself. And now the earring. The thing that gave the painting its name. The thing that colonized the painting's identity so completely in the decades around 1995 that it now seems impossible the painting could ever have been called anything else. Though for most of its history, it was called something else entirely. It hangs from her left earlobe in the shadow beneath her jaw, catching the light in a way that seems almost impossible for something so simply rendered. Vermeer painted it with extraordinary economy, a few strokes of white and grey paint, a thick impasto highlight running along the left side, a soft scumble at the lower edge suggesting the reflection of her white collar below. No contour line contains it. No hook is visible. It hangs in space by implication alone, by the relationship between those few strokes of paint and the warm tone of her neck behind them, and the result is a pearl. Or rather, the result is the experience of seeing a pearl, which is not the same thing and is perhaps more impressive. Except that it may not be a pearl at all. This is one of the quietly wonderful complications that the painting has been accumulating over the centuries. A real saltwater pearl of the size depicted here, a large teardrop, luminous and slightly warm, would have been, in the 17th century, extraordinarily rare and astronomically expensive. We know from contemporary records what large pearls cost in Delft in this period because jewelers kept accounts. 2 large pearls purchased in London in 1632 to make earrings for a princess cost £1,000 sterling. A string of 20 pearls sold to a member of the House of Orange cost 30,000 guilders at a time when a modest house in Delft could be purchased for around 1,000. Vermeer's household, by contrast, was always short of money. He had 11 surviving children and a large extended family and debts that accumulated over decades, and a career that produced perhaps 34 or 36 paintings across his entire working life. The idea that a real pearl earring of this size existed in his studio, available to be borrowed by a model or a daughter for the durations of a sitting, is extremely difficult to sustain. The most persuasive current argument is that the earring depicted is an imitation, a glass drop, perhaps Venetian, coated to produce a lustrous surface, the kind of object that was widely traded across Europe in this period and affordable at almost any income level. Or possibly polished tin, as a Dutch astrophysicist argued in 2014, on the grounds that the light reflecting off the earring is inconsistent with what a real pearl would produce. The Mauritshuis, which has to live with the question every day, has arrived at the most elegant possible answer. It is neither pearl nor glass. It is simply paint. And what Vermeer made from that paint, the experience of luminosity, of weight, of something precious hanging in shadow against warm skin, is more convincing than any real pearl could be, because Vermeer was not reproducing a pearl, but constructing the perception of one. The painting was named for something that probably does not exist in the material it appears to be made of, depicted by a painter who may have been looking at a piece of glass. And none of this diminishes it in the slightest. If anything, it deepens it, the reminder that what painting deals in is not things but the experience of things, not the world, but the world as seen and felt and understood. Now step back in your mind and take the whole painting in at once. A dark ground, green once, black now. A girl turning back toward you from the upper center of a small canvas. A blue and yellow turban, boldly painted. A white collar at her throat, catching the light. A yellow-brown jacket, loosely suggested, fading into shadow on the right. An earring hanging in the shadow beneath her jaw. And a face, illuminated from the left, shadowed on the right, the transition between them seamless and impossible, turning toward you with open mouth and direct eyes and an expression that resists every attempt to name it. What is she thinking? Tracy Chevalier, who wrote the novel that made the painting famous to millions of people who had never heard of Vermeer, described the girl's expression as a mass of contradictions, innocent yet experienced, joyous yet tearful, full of longing and yet full of loss. She spent 16 years living with a poster of this painting on her wall before she wrote her novel, and what she concluded, after all that looking, was that you cannot resolve the expression. The moment you think you have named it, it slips away from you. It becomes something else. And you look again. The director of the Mauritshuis has described a similar experience from the institutional side. The museum has the painting permanently. It can look at it every day, and still the expression has not been pinned down. Still it moves and changes depending on the angle and the light and the mood of the person looking. This is not a mystical quality. It is a technical one. Vermeer has painted an expression that sits precisely in the space between several possible readings, and that spatial precision, the exact calibration of how open the mouth is, how direct the gaze is, how the brow is held, is what keeps the viewer's interpretive faculty cycling without resolution. You are not confused by the expression. You understand it perfectly in the moment of looking. And then it shifts, and you understand something else, and both understandings feel true. A painting that permanently outruns interpretation is a painting that will be looked at forever. Vermeer may or may not have known this when he made it. But he made it anyway in a rented room in Delft, probably in 1665, and here we are. Before we leave the painting and move into the world that made it, there is one more quality worth dwelling on. The painting is very small. We noted this at the beginning, and it bears returning to because the experience of standing before it, as thousands of visitors to the Mauritshuis have described, is one of profound disorientation between scale and presence. You know it is small. You can see that it is small. And yet the face in it seems to occupy the room. The eyes seem to follow you. The encounter it creates, that sense of being seen as much as seeing, of the painting being aware of you, is completely disproportionate to its physical dimensions. Part of this is the dark background, which removes all the visual information that would locate the figure in a space of known dimensions and allow the eye to establish scale. Part of it is the direct gaze, which creates an interpersonal dynamic that bypasses rational assessment of size. And part of it, perhaps most of it, is simply Vermeer, his understanding of how much a single face can contain, how much psychological weight can be held in 44 centimeters of canvas, if every one of those centimeters is used with complete precision and complete commitment. The painting does not announce itself. It does not have the architectural grandeur of the Primavera or the violent drama of the Judith. It is quiet and small, and it turns towards you in the dark and opens its mouth and looks at you and says nothing, and that nothing has been more than enough for 350 years. To understand what kind of painting Girl with a Pearl Earring actually is, what category of object it belongs to, what it was made for, who was expected to buy it, and why, you need to understand a word. A Dutch word, short and slightly strange to the English ear, that names a tradition of painting that flourished in the Dutch Republic during the 17th century and produced some of the most psychologically intense images in the history of Western art. The word is tronie. It is pronounced something like tronie, and it means, in Dutch, simply face, or more precisely, facial expression, the look on a face, the particular quality of a countenance in a given moment. In the 17th century, it came to designate a specific type of painting, a bust-length or head and shoulders figure study, depicting not an identified individual, but a character type, an expression, a physiognomy, an exotic costume. The figures in tronies were not meant to be recognizable as particular people. They were not commissioned by the sitter. They were not paid for by anyone whose face appeared in them. They were made speculatively for the open market, without a patron waiting at the end of the process. And their value lay not in the identity of the person depicted, but in the skill of the painter in capturing something universal through the particular. This distinction between a tronie and a portrait matters enormously for how we understand girl with a pearl earring, and we will come back to it several times. But first, where the tronie came from. The form originated in Leiden and Haarlem in the 1620s in the studios of two young painters who were working side by side in those years and pushing each other towards something new. Their names were Jan Lievens and Rembrandt van Rijn. They were both in their early 20s, both ambitious, both technically gifted beyond what their age should have allowed, and both interested in a question that painting had not fully addressed. What does a face look like when it is caught in the grip of an extreme emotion or an unusual state of being? Not the composed face of a formal portrait arranged for posterity. Not the idealized face of a religious figure abstracted from the messiness of actual human experience. But a real face in a real moment with everything that real moments contain, the asymmetry, the shadow, the trace of what came before, and the anticipation of what comes next. What they found was that this question could best be answered not by painting specific people with their specific identities attached, but by painting types. The old man, the young woman, the soldier, the philosopher, in exotic costumes that remove them from the everyday and place them in a space between the particular and the universal. A man in a plumed helmet is no one you know, but the expression on his face is one you have seen on someone you know. A girl in a turban is not your neighbor, but the look she gives you is the look of someone you have met before, somewhere, in some other context, and cannot quite place. Rembrandt exploited the tronie throughout his entire career, often using his own face as raw material. His self-portraits function simultaneously as likenesses and his character studies as documents of a particular face aging through time and as investigations of what faces can contain and express. Frans Hals was another significant practitioner. By mid-century, the form had spread across the Dutch Republic, and painters were producing tronies in considerable numbers for a market that understood what they were and valued them accordingly. Tronies sat at an interesting position in the Dutch hierarchy of subjects. History painting, scenes from the Bible, from classical mythology, from ancient history, was considered the highest form of art, requiring the most learning, the most imagination, the most technical command. Below it came portraiture, then genre painting, then landscape, then still life. Tronies occupied an ambiguous position. They were figure paintings, which placed them high, but they were not history paintings, which placed them lower, and they were not quite portraits either. They were something between these things, and their price reflected their ambiguity. A Rembrandt tronie sold for around 7 guilders. A Vermeer tronie in the 1696 sale that dispersed most of his surviving work sold for somewhere between 17 and 46 guilders, more than Rembrandt's, which tells you something about how Vermeer's reputation stood among collectors who actually knew his work even then. Vermeer painted 4 known tronies in his career, which, given his small total output, represents a significant proportion of his attention. 3 of the 4 feature young women in unusual costumes with pearl earrings, the pearl appearing again and again as a motif, a technical challenge, and possibly a symbolic element. 2 of them, Girl with a Pearl Earring and Study of a Young Woman, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, were almost certainly painted at around the same period, around 1665, and may have been conceived as companion pieces, though this is not certain. They are similar in size, similar in compositional approach, similar in the quality of attention they bring to the face of a young woman caught in a moment of unguarded engagement. The typical identifying markers of the tronie tradition appear clearly in Girl with a Pearl Earring. The exotic turban, the theatrical earring, the direct engagement with the viewer, the absence of any identifying context, no room, no window, no table, no letter, no instrument, no domestic setting of any kind that would locate this person in a particular life, and the emphasis on light effects, on the gleam of the earring and the luminosity of the skin and the particular quality of a face, emerging from shadow into a single concentrated beam. This is why the question of who the girl is, the question that has generated more popular fascination than any other aspect of the painting, that drove Tracy Chevalier to write a novel, and Peter Weber to make a film, and countless journalists to propose theories, rests on a premise the painting itself was not designed to support. The girl may not be anyone, or she may be someone, a daughter, a patron's daughter, a professional model. But if so, her identity is incidental to the painting's purpose rather than essential to it. Vermeer was not making a record of a specific person. He was making a study of a face in a particular quality of light, at a particular moment of turning, with a particular expression that refuses resolution. The face is a vehicle. The painting is the destination. We will come back to the question of who she might be, because it is genuinely interesting even in the context of its unresolvability. But first, we need to know the man who made her. Johannes Vermeer was baptized on the 31st of October, 1632, in the Nieuwe Kerk, the New Church of Delft. The date of his birth is not recorded, as was common for the period. The baptism date is all we have, and he was almost certainly born just days before it. The New Church is a Gothic building that dominates the main market square of Delft, and its tower is one of the highest points in the city, a landmark visible from miles away across the flat Dutch landscape, a fixed point in the world that Vermeer would spend his entire life within a few hundred meters of. His father, Reinier Janszoon, was a man of multiple occupations in the way that people of moderate means in the Dutch Republic often were. He was a weaver of kaffa, a luxury fabric mixing silk and cotton or wool, used for upholstery and furnishing rather than clothing. And he was also, crucially, an art dealer. Not a major dealer with an international clientele and a gallery in a fashionable district, but a working dealer who bought and sold paintings on a small scale, who handled the kind of moderately priced work that prosperous Dutch citizens bought to hang in their homes, who understood the market for pictures and moved within it pragmatically and, it seems, fairly successfully. By 1641, when Johannes was 9 years old, his father had prospered enough to purchase a large inn on the market square called the Mechelen, a building that would become the family's primary asset and a recurring presence in the legal and financial documents of the next few decades. What this means for the young Vermeer is that he grew up surrounded by paintings, not in a museum or a great private collection, but in the ordinary, transactional, commercially inflected way that a boy grows up surrounded by whatever his father trades. He would have seen paintings come and go throughout his childhood. He would have heard them discussed in terms of quality and price and attribution and condition. He would have learned, before he could articulate it, what good painting looked like and what mediocre painting looked like and what the difference was worth in guilders. This is not the romantic image of the artist as a solitary genius who arrives at his vision entirely from within. It is something more interesting, a man whose artistic intelligence was formed, at least in part, by immersion in the art market, by years of looking at pictures as objects with values that could be assessed and compared. Almost nothing is known about Vermeer's artistic training. This is one of the most surprising and frustrating gaps in the biographical record, because for most painters of the period, the workshop in which they trained can be identified. There are documents, there are stylistic connections, there are later references. For Vermeer, there is nothing. He registered as a master painter in the Delft Guild of St. Luke on the 29th of December, 1653, which means he must have completed at least 6 years of apprenticeship by that date, beginning around the age of 15 or 16. But with whom? In whose workshop did he spend those 6 years? No document says. No stylistic connection has been established convincingly enough to command scholarly consensus. Karel Fabritius has been proposed. He was a brilliant painter working in Delft in these years, a pupil of Rembrandt who died in the gunpowder magazine explosion that destroyed a third of Delft in 1654. Leonard Bremer has been proposed. The possibility that Vermeer traveled to Utrecht, to Amsterdam, to Flanders, even to Italy, has been discussed and argued and neither proven nor disproven. What we can say is that the painter who emerges from this invisible period of training is one of the most technically accomplished artists of the 17th century, fully in command of his materials and his method, working in a tradition he has absorbed completely and is in the process of transforming into something entirely his own. Whoever taught him, they taught him extraordinarily well. Or he taught himself. The record does not say. In April of 1653, months before he registered with the Guild, Vermeer married Catharina Bolnes, a young Catholic woman from a prosperous family in Delft. The marriage required Vermeer to convert from Protestantism to Catholicism, a step that was not trivial in a Protestant republic, where Catholics, though tolerated, occupied a somewhat marginal social position, worshipping in hidden churches, excluded from public office, living in a parallel social world that overlapped with the dominant culture without fully joining it. Scholars have generally concluded that Vermeer's conversion appears to have been sincere rather than merely expedient. There is no evidence that he later distanced himself from his adopted faith, and his household arrangements and the subjects of some of his paintings suggest a man for whom Catholicism was a genuine rather than a nominal part of his identity. The woman he was marrying came with a complicated family situation. Catharina's mother, Mauritshuis, was a woman of considerably greater wealth and social standing than the Vermeer family, and she was initially opposed to the match. The painter Leonard Bramer, one of those proposed without definitive evidence as Vermeer's teacher, is recorded as having intervened on Vermeer's behalf, going to Mauritshuis directly to recommend him. She eventually withdrew her objection, and the wedding took place, not in Delft, but in the nearby village of Schipluiden, a detail that suggests some wish to avoid the full attention of the Delft community for a match that crossed religious and social lines. Mauritshuis would become one of the most consequential figures in Vermeer's life and in the survival of his paintings. She was shrewd, pragmatic, financially capable, and she clearly understood, whatever her initial reservations, that her son-in-law was an exceptional painter. At some point after the marriage, Vermeer and Catharina moved into Mauritshuis's house on the Oude Langendijk, in the part of Delft known informally as the Papists' Corner, close to a hidden Jesuit chapel where the Catholic community gathered for worship. This house, its rooms, its windows, its particular quality of northwest light, would be Vermeer's home and studio for the rest of his life. The same two rooms on the upper floor appear again and again in his paintings, rearranged with slight variations, refurnished occasionally, but always recognizably the same physical space. He did not need the world. He had these two rooms and these windows and this light, and that was enough. Catharina Bolnes gave birth to 15 children during their marriage. 4 died before baptism, a rate of infant mortality that was not unusual for the period, but that represents, in human terms, 4 small losses absorbed into a household already stretched by the demands of the surviving 11. The names of those who lived are recorded in wills and legal documents: Maertke, Elizabeth, Cornelia, Aladis, Beatrix, Johannes, Gertrude, Franciscus, Katharina, Ignatius, and one more whose name has not come down to us with certainty. This was the household in which Girl with a Pearl Earring was painted. This was the background noise against which Vermeer composed his silent interiors. 11 children in a house that was never large, a mother-in-law whose financial authority over the property never diminished, a wife who was almost perpetually pregnant throughout the years of Vermeer's greatest work, and a painter in 2 rooms on the upper floor, working in the northwest light, trying to understand what he was looking at. Delft in the 1660s was one of the most prosperous cities in the most prosperous republic in the world. The Dutch Golden Age, that extraordinary flowering of commerce and culture and artistic production that roughly spans the 17th century, was in full development during the years of Vermeer's career. Amsterdam was its mercantile center, the richest city in Europe, the hub of a trading empire that stretched from the Baltic to the East Indies, to the coast of West Africa, to the shores of the Caribbean. But the Golden Age was not only Amsterdam. It was a network of cities, Leiden, Haarlem, Utrecht, Rotterdam, The Hague, each with its own character, its own industries, its own contribution to the Republic's extraordinary collective achievement. And it was Delft, with its breweries and its pottery and its cloth trade and its Delftware, the blue and white tin-glazed earthenware that had become famous across Europe, and that Vermeer's contemporaries were producing in workshops a few streets from where he painted. The prosperity of the Dutch Golden Age created a remarkable art market. Unlike the court and church patronage systems that had dominated artistic production in most of Europe since the Middle Ages, the Dutch Republic's art market was bourgeois, driven not by aristocrats or prelates commissioning grand decorative schemes, but by merchants and craftsmen and professionals buying paintings for their homes. The scale of this market was extraordinary. Contemporary estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of paintings were produced in the Dutch Republic during the 17th century, paintings in almost every conceivable genre, at almost every conceivable price point, sold through dealers and auctions and directly from artists' studios. Paintings were normal possessions. They were bought and sold and moved between households as naturally as furniture. Visitors from other countries commented with amazement on the profusion of pictures in ordinary Dutch homes. Even the shops of tradesmen and craftsmen had paintings on their walls. This is the world in which Vermeer operated. Not the world of royal commissions and palace decoration, not the world of the great Italian masters painting for popes and cardinals, but the world of the Delft art market, local, competitive, sustained by the spending of prosperous citizens who wanted beautiful objects to live among. And yet, within this thoroughly bourgeois, commercial, domestic context, Vermeer was doing something that had no real equivalent anywhere in Europe. He was painting light. Not objects illuminated by light, not figures in rooms that happened to be lit from a window, but the experience of light itself, the way it falls unevenly, the way it softens at edges, the way it transforms the surface of things into something that exceeds the things themselves. Vermeer's working method was, in several respects, as unusual as his results. The number of paintings universally attributed to him today is given as either 34 or 36, depending on which scholars you consult and which recent attributions or de-attributions you accept. The range is remarkable. It is an entire career's work, stretched across perhaps 20 years of active painting, producing fewer pictures than many of his contemporaries produced in a single year. Rembrandt's catalogue runs to several hundred paintings. Frans Hals painted prolifically throughout a long career. Even painters of considerably less distinction than Vermeer produced more. Why so few? Several explanations have been proposed. The most prosaic is that Vermeer was simply slow, that his method of building up paint in careful, layered stages, waiting for each layer to dry before applying the next, was inherently time-consuming, and that he had neither the temperament nor the economic incentive to rush. Related argument is that most of his income came not from selling his own paintings, but from dealing in the work of others, so he did not need to produce prolifically to survive. Another possibility, harder to assess, is that more paintings existed and have been lost, destroyed, misattributed, absorbed into other collections under other names. The inventory taken after his death listed only 10 canvases in his studio, suggesting he had recently sold or given away most of what he had made. What the small number tells us with certainty is that Vermeer was not a factory. He did not have pupils churning out versions of his compositions as Rembrandt did, as Rubens did, as almost every successful painter with a workshop did. He is not known to have had any pupils at all. Every painting is entirely his own, made by his own hand from beginning to end, without the assistance that most painters of his period considered a normal part of the production process. This is an unusual choice, and it has consequences for the work, for the consistency of quality, for the density of attention in every square centimeter of canvas, for the sense that nothing in a Vermeer painting is there, because a studio assistant put it there while the master was looking elsewhere. No underdrawing has been found beneath Girl with a Pearl Earring or beneath most of Vermeer's paintings. The 2018 technical examination found instead that Vermeer began in paint, laying down light and dark tone areas in brown and black to establish the basic composition directly on the canvas. He painted fine black outlines around the figure's perimeter against the dark background, a precise decision other than a spontaneous mark. And he worked from background to foreground, the green background first, then the clothing, then the face, then finally the earring and the signature. This order means that by the time Vermeer was painting the girl's face, the most psychologically complex and technically demanding part of the entire canvas, the composition was already established around her. He was painting into a context that was already made, which is a very different mental state from working outward from a central figure. The face was the last thing solved, not the first. The color layers are simple by the standards of the period, 1 or 2 underlayers plus 1 upper paint layer in most areas, with clear evidence that Vermeer waited for each layer to dry before applying the next. This patience, the willingness to stop, to wait, to let the chemistry of the paint complete itself before continuing, is visible in the sharpness of the interfaces between layers under microscopy. He was not improvising. He was executing a plan that was fully formed before he began, with the patience to follow it through its necessary stages without impatience. Now the camera obscura. This is the question that has followed Vermeer's reputation for well over a century, and it has generated more passionate argument than almost any other question in Dutch art history. The argument has 2 sides, and both sides have serious scholars behind them, and the question is genuinely unresolved. The camera obscura, literally dark room, is an optical device. In its simplest form, nothing more than a box or room with a small hole in one side through which light passes, projecting an inverted image of the outside world onto the opposite surface. Add a lens to the hole and the image sharpens and brightens. The device was well known in Vermeer's time. Natural philosophers, artists, and instrument makers all used it and wrote about it. It was used by some painters as a compositional aid, helping them establish perspective and proportion. The argument that Vermeer used one rests on several observations. First, there are the pointillés, the small disc-shaped highlights that appear on textured surfaces in many Vermeer paintings, sitting on fabrics and breads and woven baskets like scattered drops of light. These highlights resemble the halos or bokeh produced by a primitive convex lens when bright points of light are slightly out of focus, a visual phenomenon that exists in camera obscura projections, but is not something the naked eye experiences when looking at a real surface. They look, in other words, like something a painter would copy from a projected image, rather than something they would invent from direct observation. Second, there is the soft focus quality of certain edges in Vermeer's paintings, the dissolved left side of the nose in Girl with a Pearl Earring, the imperceptible transition from light to shadow across the cheek, which is consistent with the slight blurring produced by projection through a lens, but exceeds what normal human vision can register. Third, there is Philip Stedman's careful analysis of 6 Vermeer interiors, all painted in the same 2 rooms at Maria Theins's house, which found that their scale and perspective are precisely consistent with a camera obscura projecting onto a canvas placed against the back wall. A match too exact, Stedman argued, to be coincidental. Fourth, there is the tantalizing circumstantial connection between Vermeer and Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the pioneer of microscopy who ground lenses of extraordinary quality and who served as the executor of Vermeer's estate after his death, suggesting that the two men knew each other and that Vermeer had access to someone who understood lenses as well as anyone alive. Against all of this stands a different set of observations. No camera obscura and no optical device of any kind appears in the detailed inventory of Vermeer's possessions taken immediately after his death, an inventory made by someone who would have known what such things were and would have listed them. No financial records mention the purchase of optical equipment. No documentary evidence establishes that Vermeer and Leeuwenhoek were in actual communication about optics as opposed to simply living in the same city and handling the same estate. Several of Vermeer's interiors include elements, tile floors, specific arrangements of furniture and light that have no single real-world referent he could have projected. If he was tracing from a projected image, what was he tracing? The scenes in his paintings are composed, not simply recorded, and a peer-reviewed analysis published in 2020 by 3 researchers, Tyler, Stork, and Schechner, concluded, after careful examination of the optical evidence, that it is extremely unlikely Vermeer used the proposed mirror comparator procedure, and that the qualities cited as evidence of optical projection can be accounted for by other means, including, most simply, the practice of a painter who had spent years training his eye to see and his hand to record what his eye saw with a precision that exceeds what most of us can imagine. The mainstream art historical position today is that Vermeer was aware of the camera obscura and may have been inspired by the visual qualities it produces, that it gave him a way of seeing a model of what attentive looking could reveal, without necessarily having used it mechanically as a tracing device in the production of his paintings. He may have used it the way a musician uses recordings, to understand what is possible, to set a standard, to hear the destination, without recording being the same thing as performing. There is also a philosophical question embedded in the debate, which scholars have not always addressed directly. What would it mean for Vermeer's genius if he did use optics? Would it diminish him? Would it explain him away? Most serious scholars have concluded that the answer is no, that a camera obscura does not paint pictures, that translating a projected image into a painting of the quality Vermeer achieved would require precisely the same gifts of perception and hand that the paintings display, that the device, if used, was an instrument in the hands of a genius rather than a substitute for genius. But the question keeps returning, which suggests that the anxiety it touches is real, the anxiety about what human skill actually is and whether we can take it apart without losing something essential. Now the pigments. The 2018 technical study mapped the origins of Vermeer's materials with a precision that was not previously possible, and the results tell a story that is worth dwelling on, because what they reveal is not just a painting, but a network, a global system of trade and extraction and exchange that passed through Amsterdam's commodity markets and arrived in a studio in Delft in the form of colored powders that a painter ground into oil and applied to canvas. The lead white that Vermeer used for the brightest highlights, in the earring, in the collar, in the lit areas of the face, came from ore mined in the Peak District of northern England. It travelled from Derbyshire to London to Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam to Delft, a journey of hundreds of miles, to become the warm, creamy point of maximum light on a girl's collar in a painting that was not yet imagined when the ore was extracted from the ground. The natural ultramarine that makes the turban its extraordinary blue was ground from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone of a deep, warm blue found in a single mountainous region of what is now Afghanistan, the Koksha Valley in Badakhshan province, at an altitude of more than 2,000 meters. It was mined there in the 17th century, as it had been mined for thousands of years before, and it traveled along the silk and spice routes to Venice, and from Venice to Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam to Delft. It is, by weight, one of the most expensive pigments in the history of painting. A small quantities of it was enough to purchase a modest horse in Amsterdam in Vermeer's time. And Vermeer used it generously across that sweeping blue form of the turban without apparent hesitation. The red lake in the jacket and the skin tones came from cochineal, the dried bodies of a small insect, Dactylopius coccus, that feeds on cacti in Mexico and Central America, and which was harvested by indigenous people and exported to Europe in quantities that made it one of the most valuable commodities in the Spanish colonial trade. The insect produces carminic acid, which yields a brilliant, transparent red when processed into a dye. It arrived in Amsterdam along the same Atlantic trade routes that brought sugar and tobacco and silver from the Americas, and a small quantity of it ended up somehow in a Delft studio, giving warmth to the shadow side of a yellow jacket and the deepest tones of a young woman's skin. The weld in the background glaze, the yellow dye stuff that, combined with indigo, gave the original green, was almost certainly grown at the Netherlands itself, a local plant used by Dutch dyers for centuries, ordinary and domestic alongside the exotic materials around it. This palette, Peak District lead, Afghan lapis, Mexican cochineal, Dutch weld, charcoal from a local source, vermilion synthesized in the Netherlands, yellow ochre from a European earth, is a map of the 17th century world as seen through Amsterdam's commodity markets. Every painting Vermeer made was an accidental record of global trade. Every brushstroke contained a supply chain. The girl's blue turban traveled further to reach her head than she probably ever traveled in her life. The question of who the girl is we have established that Girl with a Pearl Earring is a tronie, a painting of a type rather than a specific person, made for the open market without a commissioned sitter. And we have noted that this classification makes the question of her identity, in one sense, beside the point. But in another sense, the question will not go away, because paintings are made from something real. Someone sat in that room, in that light, wearing or not wearing that earring, and Vermeer looked at them for however many hours or days the painting took, and something of what he saw is in the paint. And so the question of who that person was is not entirely without meaning. It is just that its meaning is different from what popular interest in it has assumed. The most emotionally resonant theory is that the girl is Maria Vermeer, the painter's eldest daughter, who was born in 1654 and would have been approximately 12 or 13 years old when the painting is thought to have been made. The theory rests on a subjective resemblance between the figure here and the female figure in The Art of Painting, another Vermeer canvas from roughly the same period, which some scholars have also proposed as depicting Maria. The idea of a father painting his daughter, repeatedly with this quality of attention and tenderness, has an emotional logic that is entirely understandable. It also cannot be proven, and the Mauritshuis is careful to present it as one possibility among several rather than a conclusion. In October 2025, the British art historian Andrew Graham Dixon published a more elaborate theory in a new book, that the sitter was Magdalena van Ruyven, the daughter of Vermeer's primary patron Peter Claes van Ruyven, who would have been about 12 in the autumn of 1667 if the painting dates slightly later than is usually assumed. Graham Dixon's argument is meticulous and creative. He traces the Van Ruyven family's religious affiliation. They were remonstrants and collegians, a community for whom Mary Magdalene held special significance, and argues that the painting may have been made to mark Magdalena's formal commitment to her faith, with the girl depicted in the persona of Mary Magdalene, the pearl representing the state of her soul. The theory is beautifully constructed and rests on circumstantial connections rather than documentary evidence, which is the nature of nearly all theorizing about Vermeer's paintings. Whether it is right, no one can say. A third possibility is that the sitter was simply a model, a young woman hired to sit in the studio whose face Vermeer used as raw material for his tronie in the same way that Rembrandt used hired models throughout his career. In this reading, the sitter has no name in the historical record, not because the record has been lost, but because she was never considered important enough to record. She did a job, she was paid, she left, and what remained was the painting and the painter, and that was what mattered. The Mauritshuis' position, articulated by successive directors with admirable consistency, is that the painting is a tronie, designed to represent a type rather than a person, and that whoever sat for it, their identity was not the painting's subject. The subject is the face. The subject is the light on the face, The subject is what happens in the space between a painter looking and a viewer looking, and a painted face returned their gaze across 3.5 centuries. That is enough. That is more than enough. Vermeer's primary patron, the man who bought most of his paintings and without whose support the small, slow output of a painter with 11 children and constant debts would have been economically impossible, was a man named Peter Klaas van Ryven. Van Ryven was a wealthy Delft citizen, a brewer by family background, though apparently not active in the trade himself, who had a genuine interest in painting and a particular attachment to Vermeer's work. He lent Vermeer 200 guilders in 1657, an advance that was to be repaid in paintings, a form of patronage that gave Vermeer financial stability and gave Van Ryven first access to whatever Vermeer produced. This relationship, one primary buyer absorbing most of a painter's output, was unusual in the Dutch art market, where most painters sold to multiple buyers through dealers. It gave Vermeer a kind of freedom that more commercially oriented painters did not have, the freedom to paint slowly, to work on a small number of paintings simultaneously, to pursue the particular quality of light and attention that his canvases display without the pressure of a market demanding productivity. It also meant that when Van Ryven died in 1674 and the economic catastrophe that had begun in 1672 was already unfolding, Vermeer had no alternative network of buyers to fall back on. The single point of support had gone, and what followed was not survivable. The catastrophe was the rampjaar, the disaster year of 1672. In that year, Louis XIV of France invaded the Dutch Republic from the south with a force of more than 100,000 men, while the Prince Bishop of Münster and the Archbishop of Cologne attacked from the east, and the English fleet threatened from the sea. The Republic's defenses collapsed with a speed that shocked Europe and traumatized the Dutch. The army flooded the polders, opened the dikes to drown the advancing French in controlled inundations, a catastrophic defensive measure that acknowledged the impossibility of holding the line by force. Amsterdam survived, but the shock to the economy was profound and immediate. The luxury art market, the market that had sustained Vermeer for his entire career, collapsed almost overnight. Courts and theaters and shops closed. Wealthy citizens stopped buying paintings and focused on survival. Vermeer's last recorded sale of his own work was in 1672. He dealt in paintings by other artists during the following years, but as his widow would later testify, these were left in his hands. He could not sell them either. The stress and financial pressure accumulated over 3 years. In the summer of 1675, months before his death, Vermeer was reduced to borrowing 1,000 guilders in Amsterdam, using his mother-in-law's property as surety. He was 42 years old with 11 children, debts he could not pay, a market that had ceased to function, and a body that was failing under the accumulated weight of all of it. Johannes Vermeer died on the 15th of December, 1675. He was 43 years old. He was buried in the Oude Kerk, the Old Church, in Delft on the same day, a speed of arrangement that suggests the death was expected by the end, if not anticipated. His widow's petition to the High Court of Holland, submitted the following year to defer payment of the family's debts, contains the most vivid contemporary account of what happened, more vivid in its plain legal language than any biography has managed since. She described how, during the long and ruinous war with France, her husband could not sell his work, and how the burden of his children, without means of his own, caused him to decline so rapidly into a state of lethargy that in a day or a day and a half he went from good health to death. A day or a day and a half. From good health to death. The speed of it suggests something catastrophic, a stroke, perhaps, or a sudden systemic failure in a body already depleted by stress and financial anxiety, and the demands of a household too large for its resources. Whatever the mechanism, the result was that one of the greatest painters of the 17th century died at 43, in debt, with a wife and 11 children, and a mother-in-law who would outlive him by 5 years, and who was left to manage the wreckage of his estate. The inventory taken after his death listed 2 chairs, 2 easels, 3 pallets, and 10 canvases. And the inventory notes, rummage not worthy being itemized. This is what remained of the studio of one of the most technically accomplished painters of the century. 2 chairs, 2 easels, 3 pallets, some rummage. And the paintings themselves, some of which Katharina sold to a baker named Hendrik van Buiten to pay off a debt, trading 2 Vermeers for the bread that had kept the family fed. Almost immediately after his death, Vermeer was forgotten. Not immediately reviled, not dismissed, simply forgotten. He had been, in the words of one later scholar, a moderately successful provincial genre painter, known in Delft and to a degree in The Hague, but without the international reputation that might have preserved his name. When Arnold Houbraken published his major survey of Dutch Golden Age painters in 1718, the primary biographical source for the period, Vermeer received only a passing mention. He was omitted from most subsequent surveys for nearly 2 centuries. His paintings were still circulating in the market, still being bought and sold and admired, but attributed to other painters, most often to Pieter de Hooch, whose domestic interiors share some of Vermeer's qualities without approaching his light. The paintings survived. The name did not. And the painting that would eventually be called Girl with a Pearl Earring passed through the decades and the centuries in this condition, present but unrecognized, seen without being understood, waiting. The night is at its deepest now. The hours between midnight and morning when the world is quietest and the mind is most willing to let things settle rather than pursue them. Let the biography rest for a moment. Let Vermeer rest in the Oude Kerk in Delft, where he has been resting for 350 years. We will return to his painting's long journey back to the light soon enough. For now, simply be here in the dark with whatever the night is holding. There is a particular kind of person who changes the way we see the past. Not a painter, not a scientist, not an archivist, though they may use the tools of all three. A person whose particular gift is obsession. The capacity to become so completely absorbed in a single question that they will follow it across decades and borders and languages and the limits of what their colleagues consider reasonable, pulling a thread that no one else has noticed until the fabric of history rearranges itself into something none of them expected. The man who recovered Vermeer from obscurity was exactly this kind of person. His name was Etienne Joseph Théophile Thoré, and he was born in France in 1807, the son of a notary, and he became a journalist and an art critic and a political radical, and he spent years in exile because of his politics. And he wrote under the pseudonym William Berger, a Dutch-sounding name he adopted in 1855, during the period of his exile, perhaps as a kind of assumed identity for a man whose real identity had become politically inconvenient. Thoré Berger first encountered Vermeer in 1842 on a visit to the Mauritshuis in The Hague. He had gone to see Paulus Potter's The Bull, which was then considered the masterpiece of the collection, a large, highly regarded painting of a bull in a field that the 19th century admired enormously, and that the 21st century finds considerably less compelling. He was looking at the potter, and then something else in the room caught his attention. A painting described in the catalogue as being by a Jan van der Meer of Delft, an artist completely unknown to him, unmentioned in any survey he had read, invisible in the critical literature of the time. The painting was the view of Delft, one of Vermeer's largest and most ambitious works, a panoramic view of the city across the harbor, painted with a quality of light that is unlike anything else in the history of landscape painting. Thoré Berger was struck. His own word, used years later when he wrote about this encounter, was mania. He was struck by a mania for this painter he had never heard of, this Jan van der Meer of Delft, this Sphinx, his word again, who had made something of this extraordinary quality and then disappeared from history entirely. Over the following 2 decades, working from his exile in Belgium and England and the Netherlands, Thoré Berger undertook what amounted to a private campaign of archaeological recovery. He traveled to museums and private collections across Europe, wherever a painting attributed to a Jan van der Meer of any description might be found. He searched archives for documents, guild records, notarial records, sale catalogs, inventories. He bought Vermeers when he could afford them, which was not often, and pressed wealthy acquaintances to buy them when he could not. He corresponded with museum directors and collectors and archivists in half a dozen countries. He called Vermeer his Sphinx, and the word is perfect, a figure of mysterious genius whose life and work were equally opaque, who seemed to have appeared from nowhere and vanished into nowhere, leaving behind only these paintings that refuse to be explained by the context that should have produced them. The climax of the campaign came in 1866, when Tore Berger published his findings in 3 consecutive issues of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, a 2-part essay and catalogue under the title Van der Meer de Delft that set out, for the first time in print, the case for Vermeer's importance and the outline of his career as Tore Berger had reconstructed it. The catalogue listed over 70 paintings, an over-generous attribution that later scholarship has reduced to 34 or 36. But it put Vermeer's name definitively before the educated public of Europe and America for the first time since his death. And it accompanied the largest Vermeer exhibition that had yet been assembled at the Palais des Champs-Élysées in Paris, including 11 works attributed to Vermeer, 6 of them from Tore Berger's own collection. He died in 1869, 3 years after his great publication, without seeing the full consequences of what he had done. His estate was auctioned in Paris in 1892, and the Vermeers he had spent decades collecting sold at prices that reflected a market already transformed, prices that would have been unimaginable in the years before his campaign, when the paintings were changing hands for the price of a modest meal. What Tore Berger had done in the end was not simply rediscover a painter. He had demonstrated that a history is not fixed, that the past contains things that are waiting to be found, that the canon of great art is not a final list, but an ongoing negotiation between what was made and what has been noticed, and that a single determined person with a sufficiently serious obsession can change what the world knows. He had found a sphinx, and he had given it a name, and the name stuck. But what about the painting itself? Where was Girl with a Pearl Earring during all of this? After Vermeer's death in 1675, his paintings passed through his widow Katharina and her mother Maria Thins, and most eventually came into the hands of Jacob Abrahams Discius, the husband of Magdalena van Ryven, the daughter of Vermeer's primary patron, who had inherited a large portion of the collection. When Discius died in 1695, his collection was sold at auction in Amsterdam on the 16th of May, 1696, a sale that dispersed most of Vermeer's surviving works into the open market and marks the last moment at which many of them can be documented in a single place. The 1696 catalogue listed 3 lots described as tronian, any one of which might be girl with a pearl earring. The entry most often identified with the painting, Lot 38, described as a tronie in antique dress, uncommonly artistic, sold for 46 guilders. Or possibly 17. The identification is uncertain and the price is disputed, which is appropriate for a painting whose entire history is built on uncertain identifications and disputed details. Between 1696 and 1881, a gap of 185 years, the painting drops from the historical record entirely. It was somewhere. It passed through hands. It was in rooms looked at by people whose names we do not know, hung on walls in houses that may or may not still stand. Someone at some point had it cleaned or restored or relined, the 1881 treatment that damaged the background glaze. Someone kept it and someone sold it, and eventually it arrived at a sale at the Venduhuis der Notarissen on the Nobelstraat in The Hague on the 27th of May, 1881. The catalogue entry for that day describes a painting in poor condition, without attribution. Filthy with paint losses, apparently unremarkable to the anonymous cataloguer who described it. The kind of entry that suggests a painting that has not been looked at properly in a very long time, that has accumulated the indifference of years the way surfaces accumulate grime. But 2 people at the auction preview looked at it properly. One was Victor de Stuurs, a prominent Dutch art historian, a defender of Dutch cultural heritage, a man who had spent his career arguing that the Netherlands was not doing enough to preserve its own past. The other was his neighbor at the preview, a collector named Arnoldus Andries des Tombe. They were friends, and they both understood, standing before this dirty and neglected canvas, what they were looking at. And so they made an agreement. As friends, as men who both wanted the painting to end up somewhere it would be properly cared for, they agreed not to bid against each other. Des Tombe would bid. De Stuurs would not. Arnoldus des Tombe acquired girl with a pearl earring for 2 guilders and 30 cents. 2 guilders and 30 cents. In a room where no one else recognized what was being sold. At a sale where the cataloguer had not thought the painting worth attributing to anyone. For a price equivalent in today's terms to roughly 24 euros, less than a museum entrance fee, less than a glass of wine in a good restaurant in The Hague, less than the cost of a bouquet of tulips from a market stall in the city where Vermeer spent his entire life. Des Tombe sent the painting to Antwerp for cleaning and conservation. When it came back, the signature was legible, E.V. Meer, in the upper left corner, barely visible but there. The attribution was confirmed. He lent it to the Mauritshuis on various occasions over the following decades, keeping it available to be seen while retaining ownership, He died on the 16th of December, 1902. He had no heirs. And in his will, which came as a surprise to the museum because he had not announced his intention, he bequeathed 12 paintings to the Mauritshuis. One of them was Girl with a Pearl Earring. The bequest was formally received in 1903. It has been there ever since. It was hidden during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands in a bomb-proof bunker beneath the Mauritshuis, and then moved to the caves of St. Petersburg near Maastricht, and it survived the war there in the dark, as it had survived everything else. The obscurity, the neglect, the auction where nobody wanted it, the century and a half of not being known. It came back to The Hague after liberation in May 1945, and it went back on the wall, and it has been looked at ever since. In early 2018, something extraordinary happened in the main galleries of the Mauritshuis. A glass enclosure was built around Girl with a Pearl Earring, a transparent room within the room, fitted with ports and platforms for scientific instruments of considerable complexity and precision. And then, for several months, a team of conservators and scientists went to work inside it, in full public view, examining the painting with tools that Vermeer could not have imagined and that most of the museum's visitors had never heard of. The project was called Girl in the Spotlight. Its lead conservator was Abby van de Veer of the Mauritshuis, and its team included specialists in X-ray fluorescence, infrared reflectography, reflectance imaging spectroscopy, three-dimensional digital microscopy, and the chemical analysis of microscopic paint samples. It produced 5 peer-reviewed papers, published in Nature's journal NPJ Heritage Science between 2019 and 2020. And it revealed things about the painting that had been invisible, literally invisible, below the threshold of what any human eye or previously available instrument could detect for 350 years. The decision to conduct the examination in public was itself a statement. The Mauritshuis could have done this work behind closed doors, as conservation examination is usually done, in a laboratory, out of sight, the findings communicated afterward in scholarly publications that most of the museum's visitors would never read. Instead, they put the painting in a glass room in the middle of the gallery and let the public watch. They treated the scientific investigation of the painting as a public event in its own right, as something worth seeing, worth knowing about, worth being present for. And in doing so, they said something about what museums are for, not just the preservation of objects, but the ongoing and public act of understanding them. The researchers moved through the painting methodically, systematically, with the patience that the work required. MAXRF, macroscopic X-ray fluorescence, maps the distribution of chemical elements across the surface of a painting by scanning it with a beam of X-rays and measuring what comes back. Different elements absorb and emit X-rays at different energies, producing a kind of elemental fingerprint for every point on the surface. Applied to girl with a pearl earring, the technique produced maps showing where lead is concentrated, where copper sits, where calcium accumulates, and in those maps things became visible that the painting's surface had been concealing for centuries. The green background, the curtain. These we have already discussed. But there was more. The eyelashes. Under the microscope, running along the upper lids of both eyes, fine strokes of dark paint became visible, strokes too delicate to register to the naked eye across the accumulated surface changes of 3.5 centuries, but present, precise, deliberate. Vermeer had painted her eyelashes. He had not been abstracting the face, moving away from specific physiognomy toward an idealized type. He had been painting a real face with complete attention, and the attention had simply exceeded what was recoverable without instruments. The eyelashes had been there all along. The eyebrows, too, were found to be more present than previously thought, not absent, as some earlier scholarship had concluded, but very lightly painted in a thin wash that had faded with time. The girl is less abstract than she appears. She is more specifically herself, whoever she was, than the surface of the painting currently allows us to see. The skin of the face. The technical analysis mapped the construction of the flesh in extraordinary detail. The yellowish underlayer in the lit areas, the cool gray-brown midtones around the eyes and the bridge of the nose, the reddish-brown underpaint in the deepest shadows. It confirmed that the impasto in the most brightly lit areas is physically higher, that Vermeer had built up the paint to catch more light, engineering the surface of the canvas to behave the way a face behaves in strong raking light, the raised areas catching more, the lower areas falling into relative shadow. And embedded in the flesh paint, pressed into it by the brush, trapped there as the paint dried and has been drying for 3.5 centuries, microscopic fragments of brush hair. The actual bristles of Vermeer's actual brush. The physical trace of his hand moving across this canvas in 1665 or thereabouts, in a room in Delft, in the northwest light of a Dutch afternoon, looking at whoever was sitting for him, and trying to put what he saw onto a surface that was 44 centimeters tall. Think about what it means to find something like that. 350 years of time, of wars and occupations and auctions and bunkers and conservation treatments and the slow chemical transformation of pigments, and at the end of all of it, in a glass room in a museum in The Hague, with instruments of extraordinary sensitivity, you can find the physical mark of Vermeer's hand. Not the mark of his brush, the brush itself, fragments of it still there. still there after everything. The earring was examined with particular care, given its centrality to the painting's identity and the ongoing debate about what it depicts. The analysis confirmed that it is made of lead-white paint, the same Peak District lead that appears in the collar and the face highlights, applied with a thick impasto that has been partially flattened by the historic lining of the canvas. No hook is present in the paint. No fixing mechanism of any kind. The earring, or the painted suggestion of an earring, hangs by implication alone, by the relationship between those few white and grey brushstrokes and the warm tone of the neck below them. Whether the object that inspired those brushstrokes was a real pearl, an imitation glass drop, or a piece of polished tin, the analysis cannot determine. What it can determine is that whatever Vermeer was looking at, what he rendered was not its material reality, but his perception of it, the way it caught the light, the way it hung in shadow, the way it felt like something precious, even if it was not. The painting's earring is more convincingly a pearl than any real pearl could be in that position, in that light, against that skin. This is what painting is for. What the project did not find, and was explicit about not finding, was any information about the identity of the girl. The science can tell us what pigments Vermeer used, and where they came from, and in what order he applied them, and how the paint has changed over centuries. It cannot tell us who sat in that room. It cannot tell us whether she was 12 or 20, whether she was a daughter or a patron's child or a stranger hired for the afternoon. The face keeps its secret. The painting keeps its secret. And perhaps this is exactly as it should be. In 1999, a novel was published that changed the painting's relationship with the world. Tracy Chevalier was an American author living in Britain who had bought, as a 19-year-old, a poster of Girl with a Pearl Earring, the kind of poster that ends up on a student's wall without particular intention and then stays, year after year, moving from flat to flat, becoming a fixed point in a changing life. She had lived with this poster for 16 years before she wrote her novel. 16 years of looking at the girl's face in the ordinary, habitual, half-attentive way that you look at something on your own wall, not with the concentrated focus of a gallery visit, but with the accumulated ambient familiarity of daily life. What she had concluded after 16 years was that the expression was unresolvable. She could not name it. She could not fix it. Every time she thought she had understood it, had captured in words what the girl was feeling in that moment, the face shifted slightly and became something else, and the name she had found no longer fit. She described the look as a mass of contradictions, innocent yet experienced, joyous yet tearful, full of longing and yet full of loss. And she began to imagine the story behind it, imagining it as directed at the painter, as the expression on the face of someone looking at a man who was looking at them with complete attention, and that experience might have been like for a young woman in 17th century Delft. The novel she wrote invented a character named Griet, a Protestant girl of 16, the daughter of a tile painter blinded in an accident, forced into service in Vermeer's household. She becomes his studio assistant, grinds his colors, learns to understand his work from the inside, and eventually sits for the portrait that becomes Girl with a Pearl Earring. The relationship between Griet and Vermeer is rendered with complete ambiguity, desire sublimated into artistic collaboration, never resolved into anything either innocent or transgressive, held permanently in the tension between them without release in either direction. What the novel invented is almost everything. The character of Griet entirely, the servant as sitter premise, the romantic tension, the ear-piercing scene, the clandestine painting, the confrontation when Katharina discovers the portrait. The patron Van Ryven appears as a historical character, correctly placed, but his personality and behavior are entirely Chevalier's. Katharina Bollnäs is rendered as more emotionally volatile than the historical record suggests. The petition she submitted to the court in 1676 shows a woman of considerable shrewdness and composure, not the perennially pregnant and emotionally unstable figure of the novel. What the novel got right, the things it grounded in historical reality, is also worth noting. The double career of painter and dealer is there. The crowded household is there. Maria Thins's authority and financial management of the family's affairs is there. The camera obscura appears as a prop because Chevalier had researched it and found it compelling. The Catholic faith is there, and the economic precariousness, and the correct names and relationships of Vermeer's family and patron. She built a fiction on a foundation of genuine historical research, and the seams between the two are mostly invisible to a reader who is not a Vermeer specialist. The novel sold more than 5 million copies in 36 languages. It spent months on the New York Times bestseller list. It was adapted for the screen in 2003, directed by Peter Weber, with Scarlett Johansson as Griet, and Colin Firth as Vermeer, and Tom Wilkinson as Van Ryven, and Essie Davis as Katharina, and Judy Parfitt as Maria Thins. The film was shot by cinematographer Eduardo Serra in a visual style directly inspired by Vermeer. Natural-seeming light from windows, restricted palettes, faces emerging from dark backgrounds, the quality of attention that Vermeer brought to domestic interiors, reproduced as closely as cinema can reproduce it in moving images. A young Cillian Murphy played the butcher's son who courts Griet, in a role that requires him to be straightforwardly decent and uncomplicated in a story that is otherwise full of ambiguity and constraint. He manages it. The film received mostly positive reviews, 4 Oscar nominations, and an audience that was considerably larger than the audience for any scholarly publication about Vermeer has ever been. It brought millions of people into a relationship with a painting they might otherwise never have encountered, which is not a small thing, and Chevalier herself has always been clear that her novel is a meditation on looking and being seen, a response to the experience of the painting, rather than a historical reconstruction of what actually happened. She has not claimed to have solved the mystery. She has claimed to have lived with it for 16 years and made something from the living with it. This is an honest account of what the novel is, and it is a more generous account than some of her critics have offered. The Mauritshuis has navigated the novel and the film with considerable sophistication. The painting's popular celebrity, generated in large part by Chevalier's book and Weber's film, has brought millions of visitors through the museum's doors. The museum has used that celebrity without becoming hostage to it, being careful in its scholarly communications to distinguish between what Chevalier invented and what the historical record contains, presenting the tronie classification and the absence of any identified sitter as the frame within which all theories, including Chevalier's, should be understood. The 2018 Girl in the Spotlight project was partly conceived as a means of generating authoritative, factual information to set alongside the cultural mythology, to say, here is what we actually know, here is what the science finds, here is the painting beneath the story. What the science found in the end is that the painting is more extraordinary than the story. The green background, the curtain, the eyelashes, the brush hairs, the global supply chain of pigments, the physical topography of the impasto, none of this was in Chevalier's novel, because none of it was known in 1999. The painting keeps giving things up. It has been doing so for 3.5 centuries, and there is no particular reason to think it is finished. Girl with a pearl earring is sometimes called the Mona Lisa of the North, and the comparison is structurally accurate, if aesthetically reductive. Both are small paintings of female sitters whose identities are unknown or disputed. Both seem to return the viewer's gaze. Both have expressions that resist stable interpretation. Both have generated more scholarly and popular attention than almost any other paintings in the Western canon. But the comparison, repeated often enough, eventually stops being useful. The Mona Lisa is the Mona Lisa, and Girl with a Pearl Earring is itself, and what it is enough without the comparison. What it is a painting made by a man who spent his life in 2 rooms in Delft, looking out of a northwest window at the particular quality of Dutch light, trying to understand what that light did to surfaces and faces, and the experience of being in a room in the middle of the day with someone else. A man who converted to a minority faith to marry the woman he wanted to marry. Who had 15 children in a house that was never large enough for all of them. Who produced fewer than 40 paintings in his entire career and made no 2 of them alike. Who died at 43 in debt during a war that had destroyed the market for the things he made. who was forgotten within a generation and not recovered for 2 centuries. And who, in the middle of all of this, in a year that was probably 1665, in those 2 rooms above the Oude Langendijk in the northwest light, looked at someone and painted what he saw and produced something that has been making people go quiet for 350 years. The painting is small enough to hold in your arms. It has been hidden in caves and bunkers and unknown rooms. It has been cleaned and relined and damaged and conserved. It has been sold for 2 guilders and 30 cents and displayed to record-breaking crowds. It has had a novel and a film made about it. It has been examined by instruments that can measure the thickness of a paint layer to the width of a human hair. And after all of that, it is still a girl, turning back toward you in the dark, mouth slightly open, eyes finding yours, about to say something she has been on the verge of saying for 350 years. Let her be almost speaking now. Let the mouth stay slightly open, and the thought stay unfinished, and the turn stay incomplete. This is the painting's gift, not resolution, not an answer, but the permanent, luminous possibility of one. The moment before, held in paint in lead white from Derbyshire and lapis from Afghanistan, and a few strokes of grey for as long as the canvas holds. Vermeer painted this in a rented room in a city that no longer looks the way it looked then, in a light that has not changed at all. Dutch afternoon light, northwest, falling through a window onto a face that may have been his daughter's, or a stranger's, or someone whose name was never thought worth recording. He mixed his pigments, and he loaded his brush, and he looked, with the quality of attention that was his particular genius, at what was in front of him. And then he put it down. And then he looked again. And again, until it was done, and whatever was in front of him had become something else, something on a canvas that would outlast him by centuries, that would survive a war in a cave near Maastricht, that would be bought for 2 guilders and 30 cents by a man who recognized it when no one else did, that would eventually be seen by more people than Vermeer could have imagined existed in the world. He could not have known any of this. He died in debt in a day and a half, and was buried quickly, and was forgotten. And the painting went on without him, the way all paintings go on without the people who made them, carrying what they were given, and adding to it the weight of everything that happens after. The girl is still turning. She will still be turning in the morning, in the Mauritshuis, in the room that has been arranged around her, with the understanding that she requires space. She will be turning when the first visitors come through the door and stop in front of her, longer than they plan to. She will be turning in 100 years if the canvas holds, if the lead white has not continued its slow drift toward yellow, if the lapis in the turban has not faded further toward grey. She will be turning. The mouth will be open. The eyes will be finding whoever is in front of her. Tonight she found you here in the dark. And now the dark is just the dark again, and the turning is paused, and whatever she was about to say can wait until morning, or until the next person who stands before her and gives her the only thing she has ever asked for. Their attention, unhurried, in the quiet, for as long as it takes. Sleep now. The northwest light is gone from the window in Delft. The room is dark and has been dark for 350 years. The girl has stopped turning for tonight. Good night.